What happens when the truth comes out? And Officer Rick learns the shocking identity of Rose's father. This heart-pounding emotional roller coaster is just the beginning. Subscribe now to dive deeper into this gripping story and uncover the unexpected twists that will leave you breathless. Don't miss out. Rose was having a long day. At 7 months pregnant, her feet were swollen, her back ached, and all she wanted to do was get home, kick off her shoes, and rest. The afternoon sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the quiet streets as she drove through her neighborhood. She could feel the baby moving inside her, and it made her smile a little despite how tired she felt. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. The loud wail of a siren pierced the peaceful evening air. Her heart skipped a beat. Rose hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. So why was she being pulled over? She carefully steered her car to the side of the road, her pulse quickening. She hoped it was a misunderstanding, something small that would be over soon. As she sat waiting, her hands trembling slightly, Officer Rick walked up to her window. Rose had heard stories about him from others in the neighborhood. He was known for targeting black people, pulling them over for no reason, and treating them harshly. Rose had never imagined she'd be one of his victims. "License and registration," he barked, his eyes cold and uncaring as he glared at her. Rose nervously handed over her documents, trying to remain calm. "Officer, I'm sorry, but I don't think I was speeding. Could you tell me why you stopped me?" Her voice was gentle, not wanting to anger him. Rick didn't bother to explain. He just stared at her with a cruel smirk. "You people never learn, do you?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Rose to hear. His words stung, but Rose bit her lip, knowing this wasn't the time to argue. All she wanted was to go home, to be safe. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Rose's stomach clenched with fear. "Officer, please, I'm pregnant," she said, resting her hand protectively on her belly. "I don't feel well. Can't I just go home?" But Officer Rick had no intention of letting her off that easily. "Out of the car," he yelled, his patience gone. Tears welled up in Rose's eyes. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, the weight of her pregnancy making it hard for her to move quickly. As she struggled to step out, Rick grew more impatient. He grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her out of the car. Rose gasped in pain, her body already sensitive from the pregnancy. Without warning, he shoved her against the side of her car. Her hands instinctively moved to protect her belly, but it was too late. Rick's fist connected with her side, the blow strong and violent. Pain exploded through Rose's body. She crumpled to the ground, clutching her stomach, her mind racing with fear for her baby. "Please, stop," she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Rick sneered down at her. "I don't care who you are." But Rose, even in her pain, knew something he didn't. She knew that this moment would change everything. For both of them. Rose lay on the cold pavement, her body aching, her mind consumed with fear for her baby. The sharp pain from the blow echoed through her body as she struggled to stay conscious. She could hear Officer Rick's boots crunching on the gravel as he walked away, leaving her there, helpless and alone. It wasn't long before someone nearby saw what happened and rushed over to help. A kind woman passing by quickly called for an ambulance, kneeling by Rose's side, holding her hand, trying to comfort her until help arrived. "Stay with me, honey," the woman said softly. "Help is on the way." When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics immediately noticed how serious the situation was. Rose was pale, barely able to speak, and holding her swollen belly protectively. They quickly lifted her onto a stretcher, and as the doors closed, Rose's mind drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was unbearable, but all she could think about was her baby. By the time they arrived at the hospital, the entire community had heard about what happened. It didn't take long for word to spread. Rose, the kind, soft-spoken woman who was always polite to everyone, had been brutally attacked by a police officer. The news struck a nerve in the town, especially in the black community, which had long endured prejudice and injustice from people like Officer Rick. Protests began to stir outside the hospital. People held signs demanding justice for Rose, for her baby, and for every other victim of police brutality. But inside the hospital, all that mattered to Rose's family was her survival. Her mother, Sarah, paced the waiting room, her heart pounding with worry. Rose's sister, Tina, sat quietly, holding her breath with each passing second. Then Donald arrived. Donald was Rose's father, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern face that rarely showed emotion. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, a deep, burning anger mixed with fear for his daughter. He was known for being strict and controlled, but anyone who knew him could sense that this was different. He walked with authority as he approached the hospital staff, demanding answers about his daughter's condition. Donald wasn't just any man. He was the police commissioner of the city, a man with tremendous power and influence. He had worked his entire life to rise through the ranks, to clean up the corruption in law enforcement. And now, the very system he oversaw had attacked his own child. Officer Rick, however, remained unaware of who Rose's father was. Back at the police station, Rick was still boasting to his colleagues about what he had done. She was acting all high and mighty, he sneered. She got what she deserved. But the moment Rick's superior officer walked into the station, his smirk began to fade. There was a different air about the room, a tension so thick it was suffocating. Rick's world was about to come crashing down. Back at the hospital, Donald made a call. His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. It's time to deal with him, once and for all. He hung up, his face unreadable as he turned to the window, watching the protests outside grow louder. He knew exactly who Officer Rick was, and Rick had no idea who he had just crossed. In the sterile hospital room, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Rose. The baby's heartbeat was still strong, but the trauma had caused complications. As Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, she whispered her father's name, knowing that when he found out, nothing would ever be the same. The hospital was buzzing with tension as more people gathered outside, chanting for justice. Inside, the quiet halls of the intensive care unit were filled with anxious whispers. Rose was resting, but the doctors kept a close eye on her condition. Her baby's heartbeat, though steady, still left everyone on edge. Her family remained by her side, their faces filled with worry. But as the sun set, Donald arrived, and everything changed. Donald stepped into the hospital room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make people listen. He walked toward his daughter's bed, gently placing his large hand on her fragile one. His expression softened as he looked at Rose, but underneath, there was a storm brewing. As he stood by her side, memories of his little girl flashed through his mind. Rose's first steps, her graduation, how proud he was when she announced she was going to be a mother. But now, seeing her lying in a hospital bed, hurt and vulnerable, anger swelled inside him. Donald had spent his life protecting people, enforcing the law. Yet the very system he trusted had failed his own child. Suddenly, one of Donald's deputies entered the room. "Sir, Officer Rick is still unaware of the situation," the deputy said quietly. "He doesn't know who Rose is." Donald's jaw tightened. He nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of what he needed to do. The officer who had brutalized his daughter had no idea the storm that was about to descend upon him. Rick thought he had acted with impunity, just another display of unchecked power. But this time, he had made a fatal mistake. Back at the station, Officer Rick's cocky demeanor had started to fade. He noticed the strange looks from his fellow officers and felt the weight of whispers behind his back. But he still didn't understand what was coming. The phone in Rick's office rang, breaking the eerie silence. He picked it up, only to hear a cold, familiar voice on the other end. "Officer Rick, we need you to report to the commissioner's office immediately." His stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. When Rick arrived at the commissioner's office, He was met with a sight he had never anticipated. Donald stood at the far end of the room, his back turned, staring out the window. The tension was suffocating as Rick cautiously entered, trying to mask his growing fear. Donald slowly turned around, locking eyes with Rick. There was no need for introductions. Rick instantly recognized the man before him. The police commissioner, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the city. And now, Rick realized, the father of the woman he had assaulted. Fear gripped Rick's heart. Sweat trickled down his back. He had never imagined this would happen. The arrogant confidence he once had evaporated in an instant. "Do you know who you've hurt?" Donald's voice was low and steady, but the threat behind it was unmistakable. Rick stood frozen, unable to answer. "That woman you brutalized is my daughter," Donald continued, his tone sharp like a blade. "My pregnant daughter." Each word was filled with restrained fury, and Rick's face turned pale. The weight of his actions finally hit him like a punch to the gut. Rick felt his world closing in, the room growing smaller as the enormity of what he'd done sank in. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. The power he thought he had was meaningless now. Donald took a step closer, towering over Rick. "You've made a grave mistake, officer. One you'll never forget." Rick stammered, trying to find words, but none came. The man standing before him wasn't just any father seeking revenge. He was the very man who held Rick's fate in his hands. And now, Rick knew his career, his life as he knew it, was hanging by a thread. Donald's glare bore into Rick. "You will face the consequences for what you did to my daughter. But the punishment I have in mind won't be what you expect." Rick's fear deepened. What did Donald mean? What could be worse than losing everything? The air in the room thickened as Donald's final words lingered. "Real power isn't in destruction, Rick. It's in making you live with what you've done." Officer Rick stood trembling in front of Donald. The police commissioner, unable to speak. The weight of his actions crushed him. Every ounce of bravado he once had disappeared, replaced by overwhelming fear and shame. He knew his life was about to change forever, but he had no idea how. Donald took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Rick's. He could see the terror in the man's face, but his anger remained controlled. Donald was a man who believed in justice, not just vengeance. As much as he wanted to see Rick suffer for hurting his daughter, something inside him held him back. His mind was racing with conflicting thoughts, memories of all he had worked for in his career. He knew that what happened next would not only affect Rick but the entire community. "I could end your career right here," Donald said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "I could have you locked up, thrown away like the piece of trash you've acted like." Rick's knees felt weak. He swallowed hard, waiting for Donald to drop the hammer, expecting to be dragged out in handcuffs any second. "But I'm not going to do that," Donald continued, his voice surprising even himself. Rick's eyes widened in disbelief. "You'll do what?" he stammered, confused. Donald stared at him, unblinking. "No, I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to make you face the people you've hurt." Rick didn't understand at first. What could be worse than being arrested or losing his job? But Donald's plan was far more profound, and far more punishing than anything Rick could have imagined. "You're going to stand in front of the entire community," Donald said, stepping closer. "You're going to look every person you've wronged in the eye, and you're going to confess. You're going to own up to everything you've done. The hatred, the violence, the lies. And you're going to ask for their forgiveness." Rick felt his stomach churn. The idea of standing in front of the people he had spent years mistreating, admitting his faults, terrified him more than prison ever could. "You'll be judged by the people whose lives you've tried to break," Donald continued. "And if they decide to forgive you, maybe, just maybe, you'll have a chance to change." Rick's face turned pale. He had never experienced true accountability. Not like this. He had always gotten away with his actions, hiding behind his badge. But now he would have to face real justice, the justice of a community he had long oppressed. The thought of standing before them, vulnerable and exposed, filled him with dread. The next day, the city hall was packed. The word had spread, and the entire community had gathered to witness what was about to happen. Rose, still recovering in the hospital, had given her blessing for the event to take place. She was stronger than anyone knew, and while her body still ached, her spirit remained unbroken. Donald stood at the front, his presence alone silencing the crowd. He motioned for Rick to step forward. The once arrogant officer looked like a shadow of his former self, his eyes downcast, his face filled with shame. He took a deep breath as Donald handed him the microphone. For the first time in his life, Rick spoke from a place of true remorse. His voice was shaky as he admitted the hatred that had driven him, the cruelty he had inflicted on innocent people. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at the faces in the crowd, faces of people he had harassed, bullied, and hurt. He could barely meet their eyes. "I'm sorry," Rick choked out, his voice cracking. I don't expect forgiveness, but I know I need to ask for it." The room was silent. Then, one by one, members of the community began to speak. Some shouted in anger, voicing years of pent-up frustration and pain. Others spoke quietly, acknowledging the bravery it took for Rick to stand there, even if it wasn't enough to erase what he had done. But the most powerful voice came from Rose herself, who appeared via a live video from her hospital room. She looked directly at Rick, her face calm but full of strength. "I forgive you," she said softly, shocking everyone in the room, including Rick. "Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to let your hate control my life or my child's future." Rick collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by her words. The weight of his actions bore down on him harder than ever. He had been spared jail, but the true punishment was living with the guilt, knowing that the woman he had hurt had shown him more mercy than he ever could have imagined. In the end, the real lesson came not from Donald's power, but from Rose's strength. And as the town slowly began to heal, one thing became clear. Real justice didn't come from revenge. It came from confronting the truth, no matter how painful it was. Want more stories that challenge the boundaries of justice, mercy, and redemption? Subscribe now and be the first to experience powerful narratives that will keep you hooked until the very last word.